Hello.
Hello. Hello, welcome
Welcome.
to our
Thank you.
festival. We just saw your film and perhaps
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
thank you for the wonderful film that we've just seen. Perhaps my first question would be, we've seen in the film that your grandmother started this project, and then you decided to continue it. And I was wondering, what was the point that you decided to continue this project, and how did you change it from what was meant to be in the first place?
So Carole had started about 2 years before she died in 2009 this project about Delphine Seyrig. That was a kind of, how would you say, a maquette.
Oops.
The feminist activist.
I'm sorry, you were frozen for a second, so perhaps if you can repeat the last sentence.
Yeah, of course. So the initial point of this project was this prototype editing that Carole had began. She had started working on it about a year and a half before her death. She died of cancer, so she couldn't really finish the film. And it was a project that meant a lot to her. It's also what kept her alive during the end of her life. And it was a film that she had intended to make only using archival footage, in which she wanted to pay tribute to Delphine Seyrig as a director and as a feminist, because in France she's very well known as an actress, but her political commitments and her work as a director are not so well known. And so she had done this project, but as she always often did, actually, she didn't have the rights for these images. She had used extracts of films of Delphine Seyrig, and she had no rights. And so, around 5 years ago, with my mother and my uncle, Alexandra and Geronimo Roussopoulos, with whom I co-wrote the film, we had this desire to make it, to present it to the public. But there was the issues of the rights. And so we started talking to different producers, and we met the producer of Delphine and Carole Insoumuses, Sophie de Higès. And at first, the idea was to kind of edit a bit the film to make it, for it to be finished, because it wasn't completed. And in the editing process, I realized, because I eventually got hold more of the project, that it was impossible to finish the work of someone who is dead. Then it suddenly becomes something else. And I discovered during the editing and the research periods, I discovered different interviews. The work of Carole, my grandmother, so I didn't know, of course I knew some of her works, but I wasn't so familiar. Frozen?
I'm sorry,
Is
yes,
it frozen?
you were frozen again for a second there. I'm sorry.
I wasn't that familiar with her video work, and so it was a way for me to really start researching into her work and into the works that they had done together. And through this research process, I realized that actually we had to do something else, and I really wanted to include Carole's presence in this film to tell the story of both of them, because there was a very specific energy that comes out of the films that they made together, a sense of humor, a sense of creativity that's very specific to their encounter. And so even through the editing process, this became more and more, in a way, clear for me. At first, maybe the first edit that I made of the film was more like Delphine by Carole, but eventually it really became Delphine and Carole.
Because there's so much of archival footage in your documentary, and it seems as though there's really a lot to choose from. What were the toughest decisions that you had to make as a director what to put in this documentary? What was the line that you were trying to choose, and was it difficult, to choose the right images?
Well, actually, some parts of it was not at all difficult. There were subjects that I really wanted to put in image. For example, the sex workers film by Carole and Delphine Seyrigg's political commitment in this movement. So there were themes that for me were evident, and while I was researching and watching films by Delphine Seyrig, interviews, their video works, of course, while I was researching, some images really resonated with one another. And so it was kind of organic and almost magical how some things, some archives just worked incredibly well together, and it was fluid. Then the hardest part, I would say, was not wanting to say too much, because I think, for example, I really wanted to share the video by Carole Orsopoulos that's called "The Sex Workers Speak," and in the first edit, I wanted to put much more extracts. I wanted to go deeper into this issue. Although very quickly you realize that you're getting yourself out of the film. So I would say that the challenge with the editing a film that's only made using archives is to always keep a kind of attention and this string, trying to weave together between all this material. And sometimes one piece can be incredibly strong, but if it just doesn't work out with the other and doesn't resonate with what's being said before and after, it doesn't have its place in the film. And so I like to use the metaphor of the two colored circles, that when they come together, there's another color that comes from the merging of the two circles. And Delphine and Carole was really about that. It was about telling about their encounter, about Delphine as an actress and Carole as a director. But sometimes we're a bit more with Carole. But what I show about her works says something about Delphine as an actress and as a feminist, and vice versa. Sometimes we're more with Delphine Seyrig, but her roles and the way she was committed inform and say something about Carole. And so that's how I really, in retrospect, I think that's how I dealt with the editing of the film.
Perhaps I was wondering, in the beginning of the film, we see that your grandmother bought her first camera right after quitting her job. And I was wondering, did she immediately start making political videos? Did she start with these feminist political videos immediately, or was that a bit later on?
It was kind of immediately, because I think she had a form of, although she was working for Vogue, which you could say is not necessarily a very political magazine, but at the same time, in some interviews, she says that in Vogue, she really met with independent women who were often alone or raising children alone and who had to provide for themselves. And the reason she was licenciée. She was expelled from her work, was because of a political issue. And I think she had this anger. So very, very young already, even though she says that when she came from Switzerland, she was brought up in a very kind of quite wealthy background of bankers. She didn't know the difference between her left. She thought the left and the right was actually just geographical. She didn't know there was a political thing. But still, she had a very strong, I think, a form of anger in her. And so when she was, how do you say, licenciée, she had Vogue magazine said she had to leave. She met with Jean Genet. And Jean Genet, who's a very famous French writer, poet, and very politically engaged, when he said that you should buy this video camera, which is new, of course he had an idea in his head, and he wanted Carole to come with him and film Palestinian camps in Jordani. So the first film that she made was very political, and it was during the very hard living conditions and the violence that was perpetrated against families in these camps in Jordania. And then when she came back to France, she continued working in this more like anti-colonial movement, left-wing movement. But very soon she met, while she was in Beaux-Arts, because in the Beaux-Arts in Paris, they had the equipment for editing, which was very rare at the time. And so there she met for the first time a group of feminists, but really the pioneer ones from the MLF, the French Liberation Movement. And at the time, she was editing the film Le Phare, the front for the revolutionary gay movement. And the feminists who were passing by, they saw the images that she was editing, and they were a bit shocked because they were like, well, you only filmed the men talking. Why didn't you film more the women? And Carole said to them, well, actually, I swear to you, it's almost only the men who were speaking up. And the women weren't given or weren't authorizing themselves to speak in public. And from then on, she really became very close to the women's liberation movement, and she started filming the feminist struggles. But yeah, I would say that her work has always had a political dimension, or at least she would say a humanist dimension, which is feminist.
The excerpts from different films that we've seen in the film, and the films that we will be able to see here in the Cinematheque in the next days, what surprised me about them and about the whole work of this collective is that it's at the same time, as they call it, very joyful, very humorous, but also extremely radical, even for our time. I was wondering, were you surprised at any point of, these two moods merging in their work and in their activism?
Yeah, I was actually really, it gave me a lot of energy while I was researching and then editing. It just seemed like, that in a way you could be engaged, and in a way that gives you energy and that's joyful, and it's the opposite of the image often that we have of political commitment being sacrificial or being something where you can't have pleasure and fun. And that's really not what they were about. They were about, of course, denouncing and condemning things, but also about having pleasure and talking, and in a way, and I think you can't
disrupted again.
Okay. And I was very surprised. For example, Mazo et Mizo vont en bateau, the video that is a kind of response to a TV show, for example, in which it's not so easy for a non-French speaking audience to follow the film because there's a lot of things happening inside, but it's so clever and so funny and so creative with very little means. I mean, it's a lesson of how you can do very radical things collectively with quite little means. And I think that's something that sometimes we forget a bit, that we can go back to to the essential things and be effective. And also I think, for example, the testimony of this woman who's having an abortion, for example, these are images that we never show, we never see these kinds of images. And of course it can be a very difficult act, that's not to minimize it. But what I like in this footage is that we see as well that she's being surrounded, that she's not living this experience in a passive way, but that she's completely part of it. And I think it shows that maybe these kinds of procedures can be maybe done in different ways, maybe not necessarily in hospital environments. I don't know. I think it just gives ideas of, and it shows images that are so taboo still today. And also when she talks about her orgasm, I mean, we rarely hear things like that. I think it's incredibly actual. And I was, I was struck by that, about this kind of as well, this, I would say, this confidence that happens between the person who's filmed and the person who films. And I think that this was due to Carole, it was due to all these movements, and it was due to this video camera as well, where everyone was learning. I think there wasn't high expectations of how we should do it, or there was no school of cinema, so they were just experimenting and making mistakes, and it wasn't a big deal. It was more about encountering the other, and I think that's very powerful as well.
I actually wanted to ask you a bit more about this abortion scene, because it seems very daring for the time. Probably it was still illegal when it was shot. Could you tell a bit more how this was shot and planned, and where was it shot?
Yeah, so in fact it was illegal when it was shot, so it's an abortion that's organized by a group of militant doctors, women doctors from the MLAC. It was an association in France, and Marie-Thérèse, the woman who's having the abortion, so accepted to be filmed, of course, and was having it it's taking place in Delphine Seyrigg's apartment, because Delphine Seyrig, as she was famous, she was in a way protected as well by the law in some ways. She had more visibility, and she used that visibility to be engaged, and she often lent her apartment to the MLAC so that they could do these procedures in like good conditions. And I think that the film, even though it was shot, I think she first shot it in 1973, but it came out 2 years later. It was too hard to show this. It really circulated after, I think, the abortion was legalized, because if not, it would have put in danger the Marie-Thérèse who's being filmed.
To talk a bit about Delphine Seyrig, I was wondering when I was watching this film was, she was quite a renowned star, you know, people knew her, she was an actress well known in France, but at the same time in interviews she says that she's not an intellectual, she's not an activist, she's an actress. I was wondering, how was this perceived in the movement, in the community itself, you know, because she had so many opportunities to speak out in the public. Was that ever an issue inside the community, or was it always perceived as a good thing that there's someone that has a chance of speaking and being in the public with these topics?
Well, I think probably it was a good thing for the movement, because in a way, when you're famous, you have a certain power, which means that your ideas can be heard and that you're protected as well in some way. So I think it was something that was very positive for the movement, for the feminist movement. And at the same time, I think it's Delphine Seyrig's son who told me that once, that sometimes Delphine Seyrig suffered a bit from in the beginning when she arrived in the first reunions and feminist reunions that were taking place in the Beaux-Arts in Paris, that people were not taking her very seriously, because they were probably a bit impressed by her, and also a bit like, well, you're this glamorous actress who plays in Alain Resnais and dresses in fancy clothes. Like, how are you actually engaged? Like, how is that possible? But very soon, I think they realized that she was incredibly simple and there. So I think it wasn't so much an issue after that. But it's true that it's something that Carole says and that I wanted to put in the film, that when Delphine Seyrig first arrived in Carole's studio in Paris, where she was giving video lessons to groups of women, that everyone else recognized the actress, and they were all really impressed, and all their attitude changed when she arrived. And that Carole says that it was probably something quite positive in their relationship, that she didn't know her, because in a way there was no imbalance or form of admiration. Very quickly they were able to just work on an equal level, in a way. Mm.
Your grandmother talks in the final part of the film that a lot of the video material wasn't possible to be preserved, and I'm wondering if you know how much of it was preserved, of all the actions that they made, of all the videos they made, and how much of it wasn't preserved till today.
I think so. I couldn't tell you the proportion really. We would have to ask. So the center that they founded, Delphine Seyrig, Johanna Vidal, and Carole Roussopoulos, still exists. It's called the Centre Audiovisuel Simone de Beauvoir. So if you want to see any film, they have a catalogue. You can contact them, and they would probably know better. I think Carole. So I know that, for example, she in 60. When was it? In early 70s, she went to Algeria, in Algiers, with Paul Roussopoulos, her husband, to teach the Black Panthers how to film using the video camera. Because video camera at the time was really seen as this emancipatory tool against TV, against journalists, a way of making your own information. And of course, the Black Panthers were needed that, because the American media were completely deforming what their speeches and their ideas. And so she went there and she taught them how to film. And there's a lot of footage that was done there, and that has unfortunately disappeared. So I know that there are very important documents that are still probably moving around, or that have just not been restored. That said, she's kind of exaggerating a tiny bit, because she wasn't so indifferent to her video work. She knew the historical importance of all these films that she made. And unlike other feminists or activists at the time who would film some demonstrations or some actions and didn't really care about preserving them, they would reuse the tapes on top of them. It was really a tool for political action on the moment. Carole, on the other hand, she really, very early on, she had a political conscience, knowing that she probably wanted to continue being a director, and that she wanted to keep these images because they were important. And she didn't only see them as a political tool, but as a document as well. So she did actually preserve these things, and with the help of Paul Roussopoulos, who was her husband and who was a real feminist man in the shadow, but working on the technical parts and in editing sometimes. He was a mathematician and a physicist. Sorry?
You froze again, I'm sorry.
He was a...
Now it's okay, but you froze for a second there again.
So Paul Roussopoulos was a physicist and a mathematician, and he very early on knew all the technical side of it and would transfer these videotapes onto the next new technology to keep them, so that they would always be transferred onto new mediums to preserve them. So there was a work done. Now I would say that the question is that many of the works are not restored. And I know that I have been part, for example, of the restoration of Scum Manifesto. And it's a long and expensive process. And so it's step up after step. And there's not much money actually to preserve these works, and it shows that unfortunately the history of video and feminist video making is not a priority. It's starting to change, but there's still work to be done.
At this point, I would like to give the audience an opportunity to ask something. Just raise your hand and... No?
Hi, thank you for the beautiful film. I have a question related to the third member or co-creator of the center and also working in the collective, Fiona, because we don't see her much. Could you just tell some things about her?
Yeah, of course. She's so she was a very good friend of Delphine Seyrig. They had met, I think, in Lebanon, and so they were family friends. And she came with Delphine Seyrig to Carole's workshop, video workshop, and she founded with them the center. And so yeah, they collaborated on different things. She's mainly a translator. Actually, she worked as a translator, and she was a professor, I think. And it's true that the story focuses less on her, but it's not only her. There were a large group of women working together. But in some way, for me, in this film, I wanted to really talk about, first, because Carole Ossopoulos is dead, Delphine Seyrig is dead, while Johanna Vidar is still alive. And I wanted to pay tribute to, I think, a very, in a way, fructuous relationship. And for this reason, there are many other feminist women who played a very important role in video making at the time. Not only Johanna Vidar, many others. And it's true that I had to kind of focus as well a bit on, for me, it was important to focus on this particular relationship. But Johanna Vidar has done a very interesting film called J'accouche, that you could see in the exhibition that was curated by Natasha Petricine and Giovanna Zapperi, that has been in Paris, not in Paris, in Lille, and in Reina Sofia. And it's a film about the obstetrical violence and about giving birth and the violence of giving birth in the 70s. So you should also, it's very interesting works that should also be documented, but I'm sure this will happen.
Any other questions? In that case, I would like to ask you, are you trying to continue with researching what your grandmother did and Delphine Seyrig? Are you planning something else in this direction, or do you think that this film was something that you wanted to make and now you closed this chapter of your creativity in this sense?
I would say that no. Now I don't. For now, anyway, I'm not going to do a second part of Delphine and Carole or others. I feel like I've kind of explored something here, but I'm continuing to do some programming around her works. I think it's very important that it's being shown and as accessible as possible. These images should be part of our education, of our culture. I think they speak to men, women, to everyone. But now I'm working on a new film, which is also feminist, and which is more around, which is kind of hybrid, and it's going to be a feminist training course for men, and for men who are white, heterosexual, cisgender, and upper middle class. So there's going to be a secret society of women organizing a kind of civilization mission, and like the Truman Show. And these men are accepting to be part of the experience and willing to question themselves.
Is it like a mockumentary or?
It's in between. The guys are real. Like they're gonna be real guys, but the setting and all that is gonna be a bit more fictional. Yeah.
If there are no other questions, I will allow myself to have one last question. Did you think when you were making this film, because you were making this film in the era when different topics of feminism came out into the public via the Me Too movement, and especially in connection to Hollywood and film industry, were you thinking about the connections between, you know, the work that your grandmother and Delphine Seyrig and the collective did in the past, and of what is happening now also in the film industry, but at the same time in a completely different way?
I'm not sure. Do you think that? Do you mean that I was kind of trying to make resonances between
No,
both
no. It's just
movements?
how you personally were, you know, if you were thinking about when those things have arisen in Hollywood and in the film industry. Were you thinking about what, you know, your grandmother did and what Delphine Seyrig did?
Yeah, I mean,
And what has
really,
changed and what hasn't changed in
yeah.
that sense?
Well, I think, I mean, if you just look at the film Sois belle et tais-toi, Be Pretty and Shut Up, I think it just it's quite striking that a lot of issues that are raised in the film, like ageism in the industry, the fact that most roles are led by white women who often look the same, more or less, who are thin, who are. I mean, there's a very stereotypical aspect of that still exists, I think, in cinema, and I would say that's probably it's one of the most. It's like how do you say in loop. It just emphasizes all these power relations in a way. For me, it feels like cinema is just about that, about showing what's happening in reality, but just really in a bigger way. And it would be interesting to ask the same questions to actresses today. I think some things have changed, of course. I mean, now some things are not possible anymore, I think. So this is a good thing, but many things haven't changed that much. And yeah, so that film, for example, is incredibly relevant still today. And yeah, Delphine Seyrig, there's a strong parallel with the Me Too movement that was started by actresses, because yeah, it's women who have a bit of power, a bit of visibility, and who use that to defend other women, to defend their own industry, but to defend, I think, society as a whole, I hope. And Adèle Haenel, for example, in France, is in the same kind of legacy, I think. But there are many other actresses as well who do that. And even it was quite strange, because while I was finishing the editing, there was this law questioning abortion rights in the US that was being passed in some states of the US. So it's true that it's a bit strange. Like you feel, wow, we've gone all that way, all this fighting, and we're just returning. And that's why I feel like feminism and all these images work as a tool of, first of all, a tool of village. I don't know how to say in English. Villages.
I'm sorry, you were disrupted again.
Yeah, it's a way for me. It works as these images and feminism for me is a way to. It works as, of course, a way to maybe put light on certain mechanisms of power and oppression that we don't always see because they're so normalized. But it's also a way to not forget and to remain vigilant about possible turnbacks, and we see that with the abortion rights. We see that with cinema. It comes back. The exact same questions are coming back 50 years later, 40 years later. No, 50 years later, almost. It's really incredible. So yeah. During this film, although it was just before the Me Too movement, but I was already really connected to feminist movements anyways. I mean, it's I think because their way of making films and their way of being being engaged is incredibly radical, but also fun and joyful, and it sheds light, I think, in the present, and it gives energy to imagine new ways maybe of struggling, and how things have changed in some ways and how other things haven't changed and are actually regressing, and that maybe we can draw information and resources and ideas from the past. And it's not about being nostalgic about the past, but it's just about, it's important to have these images in the head to be able to move on, to continue creating. And that's why, even though this film concentrates on the 70s and the 80s, it's not only about the 70s and the 80s, it's really about today as well. Thank you.
I would like to thank you once again for the wonderful film. I would like to thank you as well for talking to us.
Thank you.
And I think we're all looking forward to seeing your next film. It sounds really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for being there. Thank you.